My name is Patricia Coleman. I'm 42 years old, and I want to tell you about the afternoon my father sat across from a mortgage broker with a legal pad and asked me to write down my annual income and about the expression on his face when he read what I had written. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the number. He looked at me. He looked at the number again. Then he said in a voice that had lost most of its usual confidence, "That's your pension." He said, "From the military." I said, "Yes." He said, "That's more than I make." I said, "Yes." That was the conversation. 4 exchanges, maybe 30 seconds total, in a conference room at a mortgage broker's office in Atlanta, Georgia. 30 seconds that undid 20 years of a settled belief my father had held about the financial reality of military service. But I need to start where the story actually starts, which is not in a mortgage broker's conference room. It is in a living room in Birmingham, Alabama, when I was 17 years old and told my parents I wanted to apply to the United States Naval Academy. My father, James Coleman, had spent 30 years as a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company. He was good at his job, he was well compensated for his job, and he had a clear and specific understanding of how professional success worked. You built a client base, you moved up through the company hierarchy, you accumulated salary increases and eventually a retirement package that supplemented Social Security. This was the framework he had used to evaluate careers for 3 decades, and it was the framework through which he evaluated mine. Military service in his framework was a noble sacrifice that people made and that society rightly honored, and that did not, practically speaking, produce the kind of financial outcome that a smart young woman with my academic record should be pursuing. He said, "The military pays nothing, Patricia. You know that, right?" I said, "The Naval Academy is free, full scholarship. And the career," he said, "the career pays nothing. Government salaries. You'll spend 20 years making less than your friends in the private sector, and then you'll have a pension that barely covers rent, and you'll be starting over at 40 with nothing to show." My mother Louise, who was more cautious in her assessments but who generally deferred to my father on financial matters, added, "We just want you to be comfortable, sweetheart." I said, "I've researched the compensation structure." My father said, "You're 17, you haven't researched anything. You've read a brochure." I had not read a brochure. I had spent 3 months researching military compensation, benefits, retirement calculation, housing allowances, healthcare, and the long-term financial outcomes of a military career versus comparable civilian careers. I had built a spreadsheet. I had read GAO reports. I had corresponded with 3 retired naval officers I had found through an online forum for academy applicants. I was 17. I was also, in this specific domain, considerably better informed than my father. I did not say any of this. I said, "I want to go to the Naval Academy." My father said, "Then go, but don't come to me in 20 years complaining about military pensions." He said it with the particular confidence of a man who believes he is offering a preview of a future his child has not yet understood. Not cruel, he genuinely believed what he was saying. He had a framework. The framework said military salaries were low and military pensions were inadequate. The framework felt correct to him because he had never had reason to examine it carefully. I went to the Naval Academy. I want to walk through the 20 years that followed because the details matter to the number I wrote on that legal pad. The Naval Academy was, in the way of things that are genuinely difficult, one of the best experiences of my life. Not comfortable, academically and physically demanding in ways that I had prepared for intellectually, but had not fully anticipated in practice. But formative in the specific way of environments that require you to find out what you are actually made of rather than what you think you are made of. I commissioned as an ensign in the surface warfare community. My first ship was a guided missile destroyer homeported in Norfolk, Virginia. I spent 3 years on that ship, qualifying as a surface warfare officer, learning what it meant to be responsible for people and equipment and decisions that had real consequences in real conditions. I want to be specific about something that my father's framework had never accounted for. Military compensation is not just salary. The salary, it is true, is not dramatically high at junior officer ranks. An ensign makes approximately $40,000 a year. Lieutenant junior grade makes approximately $46,000. These numbers are not impressive in isolation, and they are the numbers my father had in his head when he talked about military pay. What he did not have in his head, the basic allowance for housing, which is tax-free and covers a significant portion of living expenses based on rank and location. The basic allowance for subsistence, also tax-free. The comprehensive health care, with no premiums and minimal copays, which in the civilian world represents compensation worth tens of thousands of dollars annually. The retirement system, which I will describe in more detail in a moment because it is the specific thing that produced the number on the legal pad. The education benefits, the professional development funding, the various special pays that accumulate as you advance in rank and take on more demanding assignments. When I was a lieutenant commanding a division of 30 sailors, my total compensation package, base pay, allowances, benefits valued at market rate, was approximately $95,000 annually. This was not the figure my father would have found on a military pay chart. It was the figure a financial analyst would have calculated if asked to assess the actual economic value of my position. I was 26 years old. My father at 26. He did not know any of this because we did not discuss finances, and because I had stopped trying to correct his framework approximately 2 years into my service when it became clear that the corrections were not landing. I advanced through the ranks with what my performance evaluations described as consistent excellence. Lieutenant, lieutenant commander, commander. I deployed 5 times, twice to the Middle East, once to the Western Pacific, once to the Mediterranean, once as part of a joint task force that I am not going to describe in detail. I commanded a ship of my own for 2 years, a frigate with a crew of approximately 200, which was one of the most demanding and most satisfying experiences of my professional life. I retired at 40 as a captain 06, the senior officer grade below flag rank. Now I need to explain the pension, because the pension is the specific thing my father did not understand and the specific thing that produced the number on the legal pad. The military retirement system, for officers who serve 20 or more years, provides a defined benefit pension equal to a percentage of base pay. The percentage is calculated based on years of service. For 20 years of service, the pension is 50% of the average of the highest 36 months. For additional years, the percentage increases. I served 22 years. My base pay as an 06 in my final years of service was approximately $113,000 annually. My pension is calculated at 55% of the average of my highest 3 years of base pay, which works out to approximately $62,000 annually. This pension is guaranteed for life with no market risk, inflation adjusted annually through cost, accompanied by continued access to military healthcare at minimal cost, supplementable through thrift savings plan contributions I had been making for 22 years. When I retired at 40, my guaranteed annual income from the military pension alone was $62,000. I also had, by the time of the mortgage application, been working in my second career, defense consulting, for 2 years, earning approximately $140,000. My father's annual salary at 62, after 35 years in sales management, approximately $87,000. The mortgage application was for a house my father and I were purchasing together, his idea, a practical arrangement that made financial sense for both of us. He had found a property that was too large for him to carry alone on his retirement timeline, and I had the income to make the numbers work. It was a sensible arrangement between adults who had arrived at a comfortable if imperfect relationship in my adult years. The mortgage broker, a pleasant man named David who had the particular efficiency of someone who has processed thousands of loan applications and has seen most things, asked us each to document our annual income. My father wrote his figure first, then he slid the legal pad to me. I wrote my income, $202,000. He looked at mine. He looked at David, who was examining his own copy of the documents with the professional focus of someone who is deliberately not involving himself in the family dynamics across the table. He said, "That's your pension." I said, "That's my pension plus consulting income." He said, "Just the pension." I said, "62,000. He said, "From the military." I said, "From the military." He said, "That's more than I make." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I told you military pensions were nothing." I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "I was wrong." I said, "Yes." He picked up his pen and went back to his portion of the mortgage application. I want to describe what happened after the mortgage broker's office because the conference room was the moment and what followed was the substance. My father did not say anything else in the office. We completed the application, shook David's hand, and walked to the parking lot together. We stood at my car for a moment in the particular way of people who have something to say and are deciding how to say it. He said, "When did you figure out the compensation structure?" I said, "Before I applied. I did a lot of research." He said, "At 17. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you never said anything when I kept talking about military pensions being nothing." I said, "You weren't interested in being corrected." He said, "No, I suppose I wasn't." He said, "How long has your pension been higher than my salary?" I thought about this. I said, "About 4 years, since my last promotion before retirement." He said, 4 years. I said, "Yes." He said, "And you didn't say anything then either." I said, "It didn't come up." He said, "Patricia." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you ever just show me the numbers?" I said, "Because I tried to show you the framework when I was 17 and you told me I had read a brochure." I said, "Yes." He said, "I was an idiot." I said, "You had an incomplete framework." He said, "That's generous." I said, "It's accurate. You weren't wrong that some military careers produce poor financial outcomes. You were wrong that mine was going to be one of them. You didn't have enough information to know the difference." He said, "I had you. You were the information." I said, "I was 17. You didn't think I knew anything." He said, "You knew more than I did." I said, "About this specific thing." He said, "And you went anyway, even though I told you it was a mistake." I said, "I knew it wasn't a mistake." He said, "How?" I said, "Because I had done the research and because I wanted it. And because you telling me I was wrong didn't make me wrong." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I'm proud of you. I've been proud of you for a long time. I couldn't see past the framework." I said, "I know." He said, "The framework was wrong." I said, "About this?" "Yes." He said, "I want to understand it better. The compensation structure, how it actually works. Would you walk me through it sometime?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Not because it changes anything. I know it doesn't change anything." I said, "I know." He said, "Just because I want to understand what I was talking about when I didn't understand it." That conversation in the parking lot lasted about 20 minutes. It was not a dramatic conversation. There were no tears, no raised voices, no grand statements about 20 years of being wrong. It had the quality of two adults arriving at the same understanding through slightly different paths and acknowledging the arrival without making more of it than it was. We bought the house. I have been living in it for 8 months. My father lives in the other half of the duplex arrangement we worked out. We have dinner together approximately twice a week. He has stopped making comments about military pay. He has started asking questions instead. He asked me once about a month after we moved in why the military retirement system was structured the way it was. I explained the retention incentive, that a defined benefit pension at 50% of base pay after 20 years creates a powerful incentive for officers to stay through the full career rather than leaving at 12 or 15 years when they're marketable. He said so it's designed to keep people in. I said partly. It's also designed to recognize that 20 years of service represents a different kind of commitment than a 20-year corporate career. He said, how so? I said, you can leave a corporate job whenever you want. You can take your 401k with you. You can negotiate your salary. You can choose your location. You can decline the assignment you don't want. I said, none of those things. He said, so the pension is compensation for the things you give up. I said, partly. He said, what else is it? I said, it's also just right for what people give. He was quiet for a moment. He said, 5 deployment. I said, yes. He said, commanding a ship. I said, yes. He said, and you came home to me talking about military pensions being nothing. I said, yes. He said, I'm sorry, Patricia. I said, I know you are. He said, I mean it as more than an apology. I said, I know what you mean. He said, good. We sat in the kitchen for a while after that without saying much. He had made coffee. Outside the window, the neighborhood was doing its ordinary Tuesday evening things, a dog being walked, a car pulling into a driveway, the ambient sound of a life being lived in a place that has become home. My father is 67 years old. He's retired now, the corporate retirement package he spent 35 years building. It is sufficient. It is not $62,000 a year with inflation adjustment and free health care. He knows this. He has calculated it. He told me so. He said, your pension is better than mine and you're 25 years younger. I said, yes. He said, I told you military pensions were nothing. I said, yes. He said, I was spectacularly wrong. I said, yes. He laughed. The genuine one, not the performative one, the laugh of a man who has enough perspective on himself to find his own errors funny when the safe distance of time permits it. I laughed too. We drank our coffee. I am 42 years old. I live in a house I bought with my father, which is a sentence I would not have predicted when I was 17. My pension is $62,000 a year, guaranteed for life, inflation adjusted, accompanied by healthcare that my father's insurance agent has described as genuinely exceptional. My father spent 20 years telling me military pensions were nothing. He spent one afternoon in a mortgage broker's office finding out what nothing actually looked like. It looked like $62,000. It looked like more than he made. It looked, in the end, like everything I told him it would be when I was 17, with my spreadsheet and my GAO reports and my correspondence with retired officers trying to explain a framework he was not yet willing to examine. He is examining it now. Better late than never. Considerably better, as it turns out, than the alternative. There is something I left out of the main telling that I want to add because it completes the picture in a way that matters. About 2 months after we moved in, my father asked if he could see the spreadsheet. I said, what spreadsheet? He said, the one you made when you were 17. You said you built a spreadsheet when you were researching the compensation structure. I said, I don't have it anymore. That was 25 years ago. He said, you remember what was in it? I said, most of it. He said, can you rebuild it? I looked at him for a moment. I said, why? He said, because I want to see what you saw when you were 17. I want to understand the reasoning you had that I dismissed as a brochure. I rebuilt it over the following weekend. Not the exact spreadsheet. I didn't remember every cell, but the framework. The comparison between military and civilian compensation at each career stage, the value of the housing allowance, the healthcare benefit valued at market rate, the pension calculation at 20, 22, and 25 years of service, the comparison to a corporate retirement package with similar years of service. I showed it to him on a Sunday afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table and went through it methodically, the way he had gone through sales projections for 30 years, row by row, questioning assumptions, asking about sourcing, pushing back on numbers that seemed optimistic. It took about an hour. At the end he said, this is what you showed me when you were 17. I said, I tried to show it to you. You said I had read a brochure. He said, this is not a brochure. I said, no. He said, this is a serious financial analysis. I said, I was trying to make a serious financial decision. He said, at 17. I said, yes. He said, and I told you you didn't know anything. I said, yes. He said, you know what the worst part of this is? I said, what? He said, if you had shown me this exact spreadsheet, I still probably would have dismissed it, because it came from you. And I had already decided what you knew and didn't know. I said, I know. He said, that's the part I'm most ashamed of. Not being wrong about the number, being wrong about whether you were worth listening to. I said, you weren't wrong because you underestimated military compensation. You were wrong because you underestimated me. He said, yes. He said, those are different things. I said, very different things. He looked at the spreadsheet for another moment. He said, can I keep this? I said, yes. He said, I want to show it to someone. I said, who? He said, my financial advisor. I want him to see it. I've been talking to him for 30 years about retirement planning, and I've never once mentioned military retirement as a comparison point. I want him to see what I dismissed when I was 42. I said, you were 42 when I was 17. He said, yes, old enough to know better, not wise enough to actually know better. He took the spreadsheet. His financial advisor apparently found it interesting enough to use as a teaching example with other clients, anonymized without identifying details. My father told me this a few weeks later with a combination of amusement and chagrin. He said, my financial advisor is using your 17-year-old analysis. I said, good, he said it's more sophisticated than most of what he sees from adult clients. I said, I had good reasons to be thorough. He said, yes, you did. He said, Patricia, can I ask you something? I said, yes. He said, were you angry all these years? The pension comments, the framework, dismissing your research. Were you angry? I thought about this honestly. I said, sometimes, not always. I stopped being primarily angry about it around year 5 of my career when I was deployed the second time and doing work that I found genuinely important and that I was good at. At that point, the anger became less relevant than the work. He said, but it was there. I said, yes, it was there. He said, I'm sorry it was there. I said, I know. He said, I'm sorry I gave you reason for it. I said, I know that too. He said, I've been trying to think about what. If I could go back to that living room and tell myself something about the conversation we were about to have. I said, what would you say? He said, I would say, listen to her, not because she's your daughter and you should be supportive. Because she has done the work and she knows what she's talking about, and dismissing her is going to cost you 25 years of understanding something you should have understood from the beginning. I said, that's a good thing to say. He said, it's 25 years too late. I said, you're saying it now. He said, yes. I said, that's not nothing. He said, no, I suppose it isn't. We sat in the kitchen for a while after that. The Tuesday evening neighborhood sounds, the coffee getting cold, the particular quiet of two people who have said the thing that needed saying and are sitting with what it means. My father is 67 years old. He has a financial advisor who uses his daughter's 17-year-old spreadsheet as a teaching example. He has a military pension chart printed out and kept in a folder in his desk drawer. He showed it to me once. A document he had downloaded from the Defense Finance and Accounting Service website, annotated in his handwriting with calculations and comparisons. He said, I'm trying to understand what I didn't understand. I said, you're doing the research, he said. Better late. I am 42 years old. My pension is $62,000 a year. My father's salary was $87,000 a year when he retired. The number on the legal pad was $202,000. He looked at it for a long time. He was right that it was more than he made. He was wrong about everything that led to it being that number. And he is spending his retirement in the other half of the duplex we share, trying to understand the difference between those two things. That is, I think, the best anyone can do with 25 years of being wrong. Start understanding, keep going, don't stop.